a fabulous little brochure with everyone's creds. We have, I don't know, a few hundred years of experience here on, on the screen, whether we like it or not. And hopefully we can all share that and have a really open and frank conversation. So I'm going to start off, instead of telling you what you already know about each of our distinguished panelists' backgrounds, I'm going to ask each of them to share with us something that they have been doing over the past few months of multiple crises to help keep themselves sane. And as just a way of starting the conversation, Leticia, can you lead off?
Happy to. Thank you, Laura. For those that know me, I don't think this will come as a surprise, but I have been organizing. Organizing my laundry room, organizing my kids' artwork, organizing my office space, and next is my pantry. So there you go.
Now that's interesting because most people started with their pantries. I ended up making lasagna with noodles from 2013, and my husband said, "Don't ever do that again." Mary Ellen, how about you?
Well, I'm delighted to be here and nice to see all of you. I have taken the opportunity to connect with people that I haven't spoken with in a very long time, childhood friends, high school friends, and it's been a way to share the experience.
That's a terrific idea. And connecting with somebody every day, at least by phone, I found is just super recharges me. Charmaine? Oh, we can't hear you. Your mic's off. You're muted.
There you go. The virtual.
Okay.
Turn your mic on. I actually, it's interesting. I think I need Leticia to come and organize everything that I've been looking at saying. Nice. That's what I've been doing. I've got a long list of everything I'm going to organize. And then actually, to be quite honest, besides reading, truly enjoying watching my daughter cook. We have the gourmet meals from every part of the world. I almost don't want this to end, almost.
Okay, isn't that nice that you get to watch someone cook and not actually
yes.
do.
Not doing dishes, but that's okay.
Well, I've taken up biking again. For me, being active physically just gets the endorphins moving and the air and helps me kind of break out the sense of confinement. So I hope all of you who are on the call have also found something that can help keep you sane, because this has been, a tough time. There's a lot going on, and it's going on suddenly. I know that there are people who built bunkers, but I don't know about a lot of you. I was unprepared for this. I had never really thought about it as a real possibility. I always thought that there were things that were going to get taken care of for us. The force of what we have been facing lately feels like tsunami waves that have been crashing over us. Now, I was going to put up some incredibly cool, Susan says my image is not clear. It looks clear to me, Sue. So I was going to put up some really cool infographics about crisis management. And when I searched the web, interestingly enough, every single graphic that I found was of a guy in a business suit who was white dealing with a crisis. And I thought that was really interesting, given the fact that we all know that the countries that are doing the best in the pandemic crisis do have something in common, which is women leaders. And yet somehow this hasn't made it into the world of infographics yet. I also think this is an interesting topic for us to be tackling today, because I don't know about you guys, but from my experience working in the field of nonprofit arts for several decades, we are almost always in a crisis of one kind or another. It seems we just move from putting out a fire to putting out another fire. And sometimes the hardest thing for us, just in normal, relatively normal times, is looking out to the horizon. But As they say in the airline industry, in case of an emergency, put your own mask on before you attempt to help others. This is so important to get clarity about how you are addressing a situation before you can help your staff, your board, and the people in your environment. So to that end, I have asked each of the folks with us today to share with us within 5 minutes a crisis that they have faced in the past and something that they have taken away from it that's helped them, guide them, that's helped get them through it as a way to kind of jumpstart our conversation. And we're going to go in the same order again. Leticia.
Thanks, Laura. I saw the participant list, so I see a lot of familiar faces. Y'all made me a little nervous. So as I was thinking about prepping for this, there were a couple of things that really resonated for me. 3 key things: decisiveness, humility, and high fives. Decisiveness of being willing to pick a lane and own it. Humility to recognize that I'm not the smartest person in the room and that I'm always learning. And high fives to acknowledge the accomplishments, contributions of others, and to celebrate the wins. But probably one of the most telling for me was the decisiveness, the picking a lane and owning it. And that really, the moment that really hit home was during a leadership transition. Wouldn't necessarily call it a crisis, I think, but it was definitely a monumental shift for the organization, for our sector, and for the staff. And that was taking on the role of acting executive director of the formerly known as LA County Arts Commission after a 25-year legacy of work by Laura. So, and I didn't quite realize how interconnected it was to the idea of picking a lane, but it was a physical act of moving my office. The Arts Commission had one office, and that was the executive directors. The rest of us were in cubicles. And I was not planning on moving. I figured I'm the acting director. You know, who knows how long it's gonna last? I'm not officially the director. I was not owning the role. And one of my colleagues insisted that I move, and she explained to me that it was a signal to staff that someone was in charge. And that to me was so powerful, and it changed everything for me, really, in thinking about leading the organization. As the person in charge, the leader, your team is trusting that you're going to guide them and be willing to make a decision. Sometimes those are really hard decisions with major implications. You don't make them lightly, but you make them. And that's what you do. You have to pick a lane and you have to own it. You owe it to your team to help get them to get their work done. Clear the obstacles, as I have heard from another fabulous leader. Otherwise, the movement's going to stop and there's going to be no progress. So that act of moving my office from a cubicle to an office really was the beginning of signaling to the staff that we were going to get work done, that there was somebody who was going to make a decision and ensure that they were able to continue to get their work done, and for us to be able to continue to contribute to the residents of LA County, which was really our job. And again, you're not always going to get it right, and that's okay. And that's when the humility part steps in. You recognize and acknowledge that maybe you made a wrong decision or that you're headed down the wrong path, but sometimes you can pivot and fix it, and sometimes you can't. And that's part of owning it. You have to be willing to accept the responsibility for it. So as a leader, for me, one of the key things in getting through both good and bad is picking the lane and owning it.
Yeah, I think that picking the lane is different than stay in your lane. I think there's a distinction here. We're not saying that, you're not saying, I think, that people should just need to stay on their track.
No.
They have to decide a track to be on. And
Correct.
This helps eliminate one of the fatal flaws very often of a leader who becomes a bottleneck because they continually delay or defer decisions. And so everything just stops with them and nothing moves forward. I think that's what you're trying to say, yes?
That is exactly correct. It's not about staying in somebody else's determined lane for you. It's about saying, this is the decision that we need to ensure that we keep moving forward. And I'm looking around and I got to be the one to make that decision. And that's scary. It's terrifying.
And very, very hard, particularly in a crisis situation when there are so many unknowns.
Correct.
But someone has to take the
to
responsibility of
correct.
moving it forward.
Correct.
Thanks very much for that. Mary Ellen.
The experience I want to talk about is one I'm sure is somewhat familiar to everyone here on this call, which has to do with that double-edged sword of portraying a very positive story to the community that we're investment worthy, that we're stable enough, that we warrant that kind of resources with the donors' capital. And that juxtaposed with the crisis of not making payroll. And in this particular case, the situation I'm thinking about is a really high level kind of risk where I had to go to a donor and actually admit something that kind of like Leticia was saying about, and you as well, Laura, about not owning the lane or picking the lane, where sometimes I think as women, we're brought into disproportionately risky situations to clean things up. And often we are the ones that have to step up and say, yes, this is what needs to happen. And we need this investment so that we can carry on in the vision that we all hope for this institution. And so I would hope that everyone on our webinar today would embrace it's a risk, but embrace the candor of telling the donor the truth of why we need funding now, even if it is very challenging.
Boy, people really know when you're telling the truth and when you're not, don't they?
They do.
Why are so many of us bad liars? But is that a good thing?
It's liars, so much liar, but I think that in particular, as arts leaders, we want to look like that swan that's swimming so serenely and the feet are moving really fast under the water. Oh no, we got this. And everything's good. And meanwhile, it's, every other Thursday making payroll, right?
Yes, I have had the experience when I ran my small theater of not being able to make payroll. It's really terrifying. And I think a lot of people are facing that right now, but donors can't really step up if you don't share with them the real situation, can you? Can they?
Yeah. And also, wouldn't you agree, or making sure that they're not alone, right? That there's that themselves along with others, that it's a collective responsibility, not just them.
Right.
I think that's important.
Thanks.
Yes.
Thanks for that. Charmaine.
Wow. I was almost about wanting to piggyback off of you, Mary Ellen, because of the idea of having to find ways to be candid when it is difficult. And maybe I'll share that one later. But I sit in front of the window behind me is the 9/11 monument. And I sit in this one because this is not so much a nonprofit leadership story, but one I never thought I'd be in. I worked for the Disneyland Resort when 9/11 happened. And I was director of show development, which was an executive for the Disney company. And it was literally getting up, getting dressed, and the news on, and seeing everything in real time. And I'm about to go to the Disneyland Resort where I've got hundreds of dancers and performers and writers, and what do we do? And I just remember the days, both that particular morning and the days that followed, where you really start to, Disneyland is actually a world in and of itself with bunkers and everything. And sitting down and trying to think through how you keep everybody's morale up. We too close because we really don't know yet what's happening. And what you can't express is a sense of fear. And so that moment was, and you never know how you're going to operate in those moments. The only thing I do know is that throughout my time, I have come to understand that I probably operate better in emergencies than I am as a widget builder. Once I do the widget, I might master if I can get it done a little bit faster. But after that, if you give me the crises, I'm there, I'm on it, I can focus, I don't get scared about it. I might go back later and sit on the street corner and go, oh my God, what was that? But did that 9/11 moment where I actually still lead and figure out alternative plans, and at the same time worry about, send my daughter to school, not send my daughter to school, etc. But to be in that place, I'd say that was the one that, had you not asked this question, I probably wouldn't have thought to bring that up here.
It's such a great example. And I think of you as such a fearless person. I think
Now you can scare me with a widget.
because I think those around seeing, even if you're terrified inside, seeing you unfazed. So this is a different kind of spin, I think, Mary Ellen, than the kind you were talking about. This is the kind that you do for the good of your organization and for the staff. It's kind of like when you go to visit someone in a hospital room and they can look pretty horrible, but you don't tell them that. Right? You say you look great. It's all going to come out okay. Right? This is for the greater good. I'm just going to add that this topic got me thinking, of course, about the 2008 recession.
Yeah.
And although this is very different in terms of the economy and how fast it went off the cliff, there are similarities because there's a tremendous constriction of immediate resources that's probably going to go on for some time. And what I found in the recession was that it was actually an interesting time to think about what was really central to the mission of the organization, what was key to preserve, and what could we really let go of? And maybe it was actually an opportunity to let go of. I mean, the holiday celebration, which is a fantastic show, and I love it, and I think there may be some people on this call who helped produce it, it was 12 hours long. When I first came into the Arts Commission, and during the first set of budget cuts, I was like, great, let's do a 3-hour special. It was a fantastic opportunity to actually reduce that show to more manageable size. The converse of that, I would say, is during the 2008 recession, the CAO of the county wanted to eliminate the arts internship program, which is, as you know, the largest paid opportunity for undergraduates to work in nonprofit arts organizations in the performing arts in conjunction with the Getty program. And that program was slated to be eliminated. And my inner voice told me that if we allowed the elimination of that program, it would never come back. But that if we could fight to preserve the bones and even maintain it in some reduced state, that when resources came back, we would be able to rebuild it. And the fight to do that was one of the toughest battles that I've ever fought. And it took a level of persistence and iterative problem solving, in the sense that we did one proposal of how to maintain a shrunk program, which was rejected. Then we did another proposal of how to maintain the program. Every time our proposals were rejected, we just came back with another version and another scenario and another way to do it. And I think it was that sheer persistence that enabled us to finally get a greatly reduced program, but to keep it through the recession. And in fact, that theory has been borne out, because that program not only rebounded to where it was when resources were available again, but it's now grown phenomenally through the Cultural Equity and Inclusion Initiative and the realization of what a key way this was to bring students, particularly students from community colleges, into this nonprofit arts system. So I think that differentiating between what you can really let go of, what you can take advantage of to cut, and what you have to fight to your last breath to save is one of the key decisions, Leticia, that the leader has to make and be fearless about, Charmaine. Okay, so I am looking now for questions, and I'm not seeing any from the field yet. So I wanted to ask you all about how do you get everybody on the same page? How do you get the whole organization pulling in the same direction during a crisis? Charmaine, how'd you do it at Disney?
You know, Disney's an interesting animal because it is a world and a city in and of itself, and it's a for-profit corporation that you never see the total amount of money that they have, and yet you learn quickly, having lived in nonprofit world, how much better we actually do it. Learnings of the nonprofit world and take them into 500 company was huge, because we're so transparent. We're so used to being transparent and having to say everything that was an entirely different experience. Obviously it's an organization that's dependent upon everybody being a cheerleader. So I probably leaned a little bit on the fact that I was a cheerleader in high school, but where I think where it gets harder is when you have to make the decisions that you don't want to make. Like you, Laura, I was in the city of New York when I was a deputy commissioner, and we were having a recession in the 80s. I feel like every time I walk into a job, they're having a recession. And
it's cyclical.
And in the government, you have to let go. People hired, basically, when they lay off across the board versus if they figure out a way to pick in departments. And we had a seniors employment program, and those seniors were dependable. They were there. I say seniors now like somehow or another it's foreign. They were my age. They were there. They were at work. They did the best work. You could depend on them. And it was an employment program, and it supplemented their incomes. And they were the ones we had to let go. And I knew that they were the ones that I could depend on to do even more. That particular one, when I finally had to do that, sent me home in tears. I actually came home. I didn't do it in front of them, but I really came home and I sat down and I cried about that, because I couldn't imagine that life was so unfair that the best workers were going to have to go because of a system that I had to follow. That meant that after that, I put the foot on the gas of everybody who remained to make sure they could. These people lost a job and you didn't get to work. And
yeah.
So that point of how do you turn that negative into something that then spurs other people on to do what they have to do became very important. And then I couldn't back off of my job.
That's a great answer. Well, the questions are coming in fast and furious now, and I'm going to try and get to all of them, but I'd like to start, Joelle, thank you for bringing this up, and Mary Ellen, I think you can address this. How do you manage a board during a crisis?
Well, I think that is a really great question. And I think it is all about communication and transparency. And while that's not really any different than leading a team or, perform a group of artists, I think for the board, particularly since they're invested not only financially, but to a certain extent, their reputation, that this is the time to have even a weekly conference call or a Zoom nowadays, to give the board members the opportunity to express their opinions and/or desires. They often have valuable insight. So I think it's an over communication strategy. Also pushing out information. I'm one to have a weekly newsletter, for example, to all the board, orchestra, staff. You know, it's.
I love that. I used to do a weekly memo to the board, and then it became kind of a monthly memo to my commissioners, one of
Yeah.
whom is on the call with us today. Yeah, let them know.
I think that, again, what I was saying earlier, that transparency, but not just tell them about the problem. You tell them in much detail as you can what you're going to do about it, how important they are, how they're a critical ingredient to what success looks like on the other side. And so I think it's a regular cadence of a combination of divulging the truth plus wrapping it in how we're going to all work together to make it happen.
Yeah.
Yes, Leticia,
Well, I
and
just
then I
wanted
have something else.
Yeah, just to add in terms of the transparency, part of that is also what the expectation of them is. You know, being clear of what the ask is going to be. What do we need them to do? And that's the same for the staff, I think, in many ways, to your previous question, Laura, but the idea that you're transparent, but you also have an ask so that people can feel as though they can wrap their head around whatever the situation might be. And that ask may not be big, but it's something so that people feel like they're participating in part of the solution.
Yeah, the more specific the ask to a board member, the more likely you are to be successful, right? Telling a board we need money is not going to get you any money. Asking a board member to specifically set up a lunch with this person to discuss this situation, to solve this problem within the next week, is much more likely to result. So making the action extremely specific. A couple of the questions have very similar asks, Deborah and also Denise. When there is so much unknown, how do you make effective decisions? When in some ways what you don't know, right, in this current situation exceeds what we do know, and where things are constantly changing all the time. Leticia, you must be experiencing that right now at the music center.
Just a little.
Yeah.
You know, one of the biggest things is to focus on what is it that we do know. We know that we have, just in terms of our current situation, we know that we have a staff that's working really diligently to produce product, content. We know that we have wonderful partners and collaborators that we've been working with for many years. And so how might we lift that up? The reality is we can't control what's going to happen with the budget. We can't control what's going to happen with the pandemic. We can't control. And so because of that, we've really taken a moment to focus on, these are the resources we have. This is what we can build upon. And how can we move that forward? And also recognizing that, you know, I've often said the opportunity to break the system would be kind of cool. Well, the system's been broken for us in many ways. And this moment of reinvention and starting over, but not from scratch, but from a point of what kind of an organization do we actually want to be? You know, and if we bring in the whole conversation in terms of our responsibility as an anti-racist organization and our responsibility when we talk about racial equity, what does that mean? What does that look like? How are we addressing that in everything that we do? So it's a lot, but we're focusing on what we have and how we can actually use that to serve, for us specifically, the county.
You know, Constance asked a related question. How do you know when to go slow and how do you know when to go fast? Any thoughts on that?
Sure. I actually, to be quite honest, I think that no matter what the situation is, you have to be very clear that when you're making a decision, are you making it about a short-term problem or for what could be a long-term solution? So if the issue of the moment, when you go to make that decision, is it going to have long-term impact, or are you making a decision that you know is short-term, at which point you can tell everybody that, and you can have that open discussion, and we will come back and look at this again? Or do you really need to stop and say, wait a minute, I've got a value proposition within my soul, within our mission, within our organization, and am I living up? I'm going to cite an example, and it kind of ties into something Mary Ellen said earlier. When I was at Dentist Theater of Harlem, we had a funder, a big funder, who was giving us a bunch of money that was going to have their name put on something. And they came in and said, we want to give you this money, but we want you to not continue to take money from Philip Morris. In those days, Philip Morris was in the arts, huge. Laura can tell you all, and we looked at this funder who was not nearly getting ready to replace anything that they had done. And I had to sit there a minute with Arthur Mitchell sitting next to me and make a decision about what I was going to say next. And these happen to be white funders. We're in Harlem. This is big money. And I finally said, look, I really appreciate the fact that you're concerned that we have money coming from a company that sells cigarettes. And like I said, everybody hadn't totally divested yet, but it's legal. And I'm going to sit here in all of my blackness and tell you that a lot of people died for me to be able to have the right to do whatever's legal, including my mother, who I wish didn't smoke. She's not with us anymore, but I wished she didn't. And if that's how she wants to take herself out on something that's legal, unless you're getting ready to replace their money, I can't just give you that. And then I switched it. But if what you're concerned about is that we don't have enough other kinds of stores in our neighborhood, that we don't have other kind of businesses advertising in our neighborhood, that other kinds of funders are not supporting us, join us and get the other kinds of funders, rather than asking me to cut my nose off to spite my face when I have so little access to begin with. That's risky. It's based on having a set of values in your gut from the beginning, which kind of ties into what Letitia said and what Mary Ellen said, that once you have that, then you're not running around in the middle of a fire screaming, oh my God, it's a fire, it's a fire, it's a fire, because that's when you're going to burn up. The people who don't burn up are the ones who figure out how to get out of the building, get somebody else out of the building, and then sit down and go, oh my God.
But I think what you just raised is key, because every decision has to be made within the context of the mission of the organization. And as long as you keep refocusing on that mission and asking yourself, is what you're doing either short-term or long-term furthering that mission? Or is it moving you away from the mission or outside the mission? That will be your guide, right? We've got several questions that have come up because the situation with the current pandemic has caused a lot of layoffs, a lot of furloughs, a lot of uncertainty. The nature of people's jobs are changing. Working from home is different than going to the office, than meeting people with people in person. Some jobs lend themselves more to it, some don't. Some people are questioning, are they still in the right job? Some people who still have jobs are questioning, are they in the right job? Is this the right time, actually, to make a change and to move on? And some of these questions have to do with, how do you make that decision for yourself, whether this is the right time or place to stick with something? And how do you help people in your organization that you're forced, as you did, Charmaine, to transition out? Who wants to take that one?
Well, I'll jump in and start it. I think that, I don't know about everyone on the call, but the end of the fiscal year where I'm working right now is tomorrow, right? And this offers a really nice opportunity to reflect structurally, formally about what's happened over the last months, or and to have a conversation, a transparent conversation with people about really what they want to do. and give them, it's a nice opportunity for them to talk about what they liked, what they wish had happened, had we been able to control it. So I would take advantage of the structural end of the fiscal year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I've never fired anyone. I find that when people are failing at something, they know it, and they're dreadfully unhappy. And usually when I've sat down and I've had a really transparent, honest conversation with them and asked them what they really want to be doing, they tell me that it's something completely different. And that opens the door for me to have a conversation with them about how can I help you get to this other thing that's going to be a better fit, that's going to be more meaningful. How can we work this transition so it's smooth for you and works for us both? But I think that sometimes people are so bound by what they hear from the HR departments that they're afraid to actually talk to people like they're people and find out what they need and what they want.
Mm-hmm.
Charmaine, you're thinking very loudly.
Sorry, I was thinking about the kind of issue where, yeah, I actually have, I mean, besides have to let people go just because budget cuts and the structure required it, and I've had to negotiate union strikes, and at the same time, I've had to try to let people know that when we're asking more of them, which is what's going on right now, that you see that you actually see that you're asking more of them. I mean, it's real easy for people to think, well, they're working from home, so it's not a problem. No, this is harder than if we were all sitting in the same place. And as a leader, you've got to constantly be telling the people who are working for you that when you're asking more of them, that you see that you're asking more. The question is whether or not the systems around, especially when you're in government, whether the systems around them are going to treat the people as if somehow or another they should still be judged by the previous standard or the previous set of work circumstances. And it's your job as a leader to make sure everybody's understanding. I see that these circumstances are different. If the job said that you needed to come in from 9 to 5 and this is what you did, and for the last 10 weeks, I've been asking you to work 24/7 because you're working around caring for your kids, I've got to recognize that as the boss, and I might have to take up the slack.
Leticia, how do you know when it's time to move on? Oh, you froze. Uh-oh, that was such a tough question that Leticia actually froze. Okay, and Leticia, if you don't unfreeze, you may actually have to leave the session and come back in. I'm so sorry. You may have to do that. Try turning your camera off.
Well, that's actually piggybacking on what a couple of, hi.
Okay.
I've shut down. Can you hear me?
Yes, and please turn your camera back on again.
I did. Okay. Hi, sorry about that.
Okay, great.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, building on what you've all said, but it's also, I think, Laura, it's totally and completely true, having the conversation to understand where folks are trying to get to. And as part of that, one of the things that I always, in my conversations, and it sounds kind of harsh as I think about it, but it's only you are going to be able to take care of yourself. Ultimately, you have to make the decision on what's right for you. And it's hard to get there, but that's part of that conversation with the folks around you, with your boss or with somebody that works for you, to have that conversation, to think through it. But ultimately, nobody else is going to bend over backwards for you except for you, because that's the reality of it. And so at a certain moment, making that decision to make the transition, I recognize at this moment in time, that's extra terrifying. but you know, I have found personally that it's been those moments when I finally recognized this isn't good for me anymore. And that's okay. I have to move on to get to wherever I need to get to next.
And very often, would you say that what has caused that feeling is because there's a kind of misalignment between your personal mission and the organization's mission?
Yes. I have been saying a lot lately, the challenge that we all, I think, experience with our balancing between our personal conviction and the organization's position. And if ever there was a moment in time, here we are. And I do think that at a certain point, again, I recognize it's a real sense of privilege to be able to say, I'm going to make a decision to leave this job because of my personal conviction. But I think ultimately what ends up happening is what you described, Laura, which is I'm miserable at my job for these reasons. Being able to actually get to that point is the hard part, but having somebody who you can have that conversation with, yeah, it's a huge struggle that, you know, I think we all go through regardless of where you are in an organization.
So, as we know, the arts community is sometimes a really important part of furthering important cultural equity issues, and sometimes a huge barrier, depending upon the organization and its context and its circumstances, right? This is not a one-size-fits-all for our field. On top of the pandemic, right, we have a realization, I don't know why it's taken so long, but here we are finally, that every institution has a responsibility. So does this create an additional layer of complexity during a time of enormous economic contraction, or an opportunity to really rethink institutions from the ground up?
I'm on that side. Personally, I've always said, stepping into my current position, that I want to redefine what a cultural institution, an anchor cultural institution is, because for so long that has been a negative connotation, right? Sucks all the money, sucks all the resources, all of those things, is not taking responsibility for equity. And in many ways, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about breaking the system, but we're at that moment. And although it is terrifying, it's an opportunity that we may not get again. And it's, how do we meet this moment? And what do we do as an organization to step into what we mean when we talk about racial equity?
Yeah. Other thoughts about this?
Well, I want to chime in terms of where we are right now. Some organizations have never recovered from 2008, right? And in terms of having a paradigm or a set of values for your organization, and whether it turns out that, you know, holding those so dear, even amidst a crisis, I think sometimes it's overly simplistic, but there ends up being heroes and villains. And that sometimes, especially if there was already a fiscal crisis, and on top of that, we've never been really mindful of inclusion and diversity. So now we have a double whammy of surviving and being sustainable. And now, while there are people that are just wanting to latch themselves to the past, right? I think it's hard.
Yeah, it's hard enough to break with a future that's live.
Yeah.
To completely reimagine a future in terms of programming, in terms of staffing, in terms of board. And this relates to another question that someone had about boards, which is, how do you help boards make the decisions about what the future programs and options look like. And I would respond to that again, particularly when you're looking at cuts in the organization. That what I have found to be most successful is not to present a kind of fait accompli scenario. Gee, this is what I worked out. This is what I worked out with the staff. This is what we think you should do. Here it is, take it or leave it. I always like to present at least 3 options that allows a board to engage at a really significantly high policy level around what these options mean in terms of the future of the organization, its future programming, its future finances, its future positioning as a community resource, and its mission. Because, yeah, Charmaine, because the more you can focus your board on those big policy decisions, the more they're going to stay out of your hair on the small operational issues and let you get on with the job of implementing it. But that's really what you want a board and the guidance to do. Charmaine, your thoughts?
I want to come to that, but I had actually wanted to respond to the last question, if I might, and then
please.
Previous question. What you do in this moment has an enormous amount to do with who you are and what your world experience has been. I had often been saying to a lot of folks who know me that the next time there's a set of major protests, and this was before the George Floyd killing, it's probably going to need to be white people who are walking the streets, and I'll stand behind them, because the issue will be theirs to solve. It may have been the burden of myself and people of color, et cetera, to bear it, but it is a problem to be solved by the folks who either bear the inheritance of it or need to work it out. So each organization, each human being has to stop and look at where they fit in the scheme of where they operate and function in the world. And that even includes organizations of color, so that while there are organizations of color that are seeking to say, I'm not concerned about equity as much. I'm concerned about access. What I never had was the access. And I think it was Jon Stewart the other night who said, while Black people were fighting for equality, white people were building up equity. And by the time we got around to realizing, wait a minute, I don't have any of that equity, they built up more equity. So now we're like, so you're constantly, so the conversation around, and I thanked Jon Stewart for that. I wrote it down when I heard him say it. I went, that's just so simple. So the issue is, who are you? Where do you stand in the world when you reach that moment of crisis? And what do you have to do with it? So in place, it's constantly saying, did the Music Center ask the right question, or did it decide what it thinks the answer is? Did I stop and give room for somebody to help me, or did I automatically just assume they can't? When in fact, the reality is that unless as a country, I'm not trying to get political now, but as a country, not just our organizations, but unless we reform the underlying systems that exist in the way we do things, where everything is dependent upon money, that's the answer to every decision that's ever been, in slavery, don't end slavery, all that kind of stuff. If that is the issue, then we've got to shake it up enough that money is not the end all answer, because money is not always the end all answer to leadership either. And I think one of the reasons that women end up sometimes being better leaders, or at least I'm going to claim it, is because we have so many survival techniques we have to put in place. Whether it's when you have children or you don't have children, there's these sort of motherly instincts that come in, and they live throughout our life, and then we spend a part of our time trying to get rid of them so we can be more like a man so they'll accept us. But we have those, and depending on what your stature is in life, you may have been living survival techniques all your life. So when you ask a lot of organizations of color a moment, and it is hard for them and they still didn't have access, or you ask them about every other moment of crises where somehow or another they're constantly knowing that they're living in a state of survival and having to constantly reach in that bucket of hope. If they didn't, it would be impossible to survive. If you've never had to deal with that struggle, what you're facing right now is a brand new kind of struggle. And the most I can do is figure out how to help you through it. But like a mother with a child, I can't save you from it. And I have to be aware that I can't save you from it, but that I can help you through it so that at the end of the day, we can come out together. And I needed to stop and say that, because I think that also plays into the issue of leadership, including then with your board, and whether or not you've gone to your board and as Mary Ellen said, you're communicating. As you said, Laura, that you're giving them notes, you're giving them updates, you're sharing with them what you're thinking about doing, and you give them a chance to give some input, because when it's in the worst crises, what they really want to do is find a way to help, and money is not always the answer.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
You know, we have a few questions that really focus on how you handle things when you're at that mid-level in an organization. You're a sandwich between the leadership and the folks on the line. And the questions have to do really, I think, with how do you lead from behind? How do you manage up? How can you be a conduit for trust between those above you and those who are working under you? How do you manage in that space?
I got one line: pick and choose your battles.
Well, so first of all, you know, I'm going to go back to when in doubt, be more specific. Just what I do with board members. My staff became masters at managing me, and and I would see them do it, and I would be like, "Whoa, that's good," because they learned. They helped train me by saying things to me like, "Okay, I understand what you want me to do with that project. When do you need it by? When would you like to have it? Would you like to see at what stage in the project would you like to review it?" And I was like, oh, they're giving me cues that I'm supposed to set clear parameters and deadlines. So I would really urge folks who are managing up to do so by asking the person above you really specific questions and force them to give you really specific answers that will help you move forward. And then, of course, communicate all of that to everyone else on the team. Leticia? As someone who used to manage
I was going to say, I feel a little vulnerable because this is not about you. I'm not going to say what I'm about to say.
Okay.
But it's the, you know, that managing up and managing down is probably one of the hardest places to have to be, because you have to balance both. You have to understand how to push up to clear the obstacles. And this is something that I learned from you. I mean, that's the reality of it. It's like, you know, your job is to just make way for the people around you to get their job done. And so, and, you know, often the challenge is when you're so caught with a giant boulder at the top that you can't penetrate it. Part of that, I think, is back to the mission and the goal. And what is it that your job, how does your job fit into the mission of the organization? And, you know, you don't want to have to work around, but sometimes you work around to get your job done. And that, I think, often falls into the middle management of, I'm going to figure out how to clear obstacles above so that everybody below me. So I would say it really just centering back to my job in this organization is to move towards that goal. And how do you ensure that the people below you are able to do it? How do you get it done? And if that means that you have to work a little extra hard, yeah. And then that goes back to a whole other conversation that we had earlier, when there's a moment where you're going to know that's no longer acceptable to you and you have to make a change.
Well, and this relates to a question that Stephen had, because the same works in terms of setting clear expectations to the people who are working under you. You can't hold people accountable, even in a crisis, right? Where everyone's having a hard time, unless together you come to a clear set of expectations about what the work is that needs to be done and how it needs to be done. Because unless you have clearly outlined those expectations and those parameters, you cannot, there's no way to hold anyone accountable. And that's going to be equally true whether they're working from home, I think, or they're not. Also related, while we're on staff issues, Anonymous asks for a friend, how do you rebuild trust when staff trust erodes through these difficult decisions? How do you rebuild trust?
I'm gonna jump in and repeat about the consistency and communication, the regular sessions, one-on-one sessions, team building sessions, engagement, things to give people the opportunity to express themselves, and not just one way, because people want to do it in different ways. Sometimes it's actually doing projects together, perhaps in a different way. I think it's about communication and just in mixing it up in different ways. And you have to be honest, you may not be able to rebuild trust completely. I mean, it may be such a profoundly impactful situation that some people may never get there, but you still have to do it. You still have to persevere and do the communication exercises to bring them along.
And I was just going to add that I think some of this has to do with everyone's individual management style. There are some managers who just simply tell you what to do, and they can spell out all the specifics to do and never tell you why they do it. And there are other managers who are probably like me, who will tell you everything. I'm going to tell you every reason why I've reached the conclusion that I've reached, and why we need to go in X direction, and why I ruled out some of the other things that we were going to do, so that you're privy to my thinking. Because if I share that back with you, you might share back something I missed. And so I'm not uncomfortable with the idea of having somebody come back and say to me, I don't think so for the following reason. And we actually kind of, I don't want to say debate it out, but figure it out, just in case I miss thinking about something. In order to do that, you have to be a leader who's comfortable with not just giving a direction, but explaining to someone why you came up with that conclusion, as opposed to thinking, leader, and I don't have to tell you why I came up with that decision. Now, sometimes you do have to put your foot down and go, because I said so. But generally speaking, if you want trust, when you get to a difficult moment, even sometimes when you tell everybody the truth right away, know that you've, one, thought about it, and two, you will explain it to them later on, and that you will talk to them about it, and that you value telling them, as opposed to you're just a minion and I don't have to explain anything to you. So I think that that's the hardest part. And then if you're trying to manage up or down the ladder, aside from, pick and choose your battles, it really does mean just because you don't agree with what your boss says for you to do, maybe there's a good reason for you to do it. And if so, you might want to ask more questions but don't spend your time trying to change your. And I have run into lots of people, and early on in my career had to learn not to spend my time trying to change my boss, but to figure out how I could deliver what my boss was asking for, even if I thought it was unfair that they asked me for it. And then make up my mind whether or not this is something I want to keep continuing. And that, when you're younger and you're going through that, it's much harder because you're very idealistic and you've reached certain conclusions. But as you go through more and more jobs or experiences, you start to realize that what you thought was so important might not be as critical as something else. And if you skip over this in order to get else, you might get where you're trying to go a little sooner. So I would suggest breathe a minute. Just take a moment to breathe, especially if you're managing in the middle and managing up and down and you're trying to figure out what's the right way to go, as opposed to just let me show everybody how smart I am. Because it might be a decision you wanted to make in the end.
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said, Charmaine. And so much of it comes back to mission, doesn't it? Because if you are making decisions, if leadership is making decisions based on mission and purpose and vision and communicating that so that it's clear to everyone that the decisions are not being made capriciously or arbitrarily or for the benefit of someone personally, I have found that whether or not people necessarily agree with that decision, that you will never lose trust.
Can I add one more thought to this, Laura, which is as when you get put into the leadership position at whatever level it is, when you have to judge between, but I want to be liked, and responding to whether or not you can make people like you versus what it is that you have to do. And it's very hard sometimes to be in a situation, particularly with employees, especially if you can't do anything about them, which sometimes government situations can create, where you have to live with an employee that, short of the fact that they're in the same job with you, probably wouldn't give the time of day to. And they don't like you and you don't necessarily like them. But what you do have to do as a leader is always give your employees respect. You do have to keep giving them a voice, even if you are not necessarily trusting either what they're saying is true or that they are actually going to really put their best foot forward. But that's the hard part, when you can't just turn to everybody who works for you and think of them as your friend. And you that has to be remembered, because if it doesn't, it can send you into tears when you look up and find out that you might have some employees who, would stab you if they could, just for proving that they could, right?
But modeling for them the way that you want them to act in your organization in the world is, I couldn't agree more, completely important. I want to shift gears to some other big questions that have come up. I know you all have ginormous crystal balls, and I want you to look in them and share with us what your thinking is of how nonprofits, and this came from Lee Werbel, how do we see nonprofits maintaining and surviving, especially in the arts? Well, of course, that's what we're talking about here, in the arts. What's your crystal ball say? What's going to happen to these organizations coming out of the pandemic? Mary Ellen?
Well, I think some of the, on one hand, geographically, we're going to continue to see contraction to the big city centers. And I think that the more regional places in our country are going to have an opportunity to be a little bit more I'll say ambitious or a little bit more edgy about what they're about. I think there's that possibility. I think whether you are in that regional scenario or in the big city center, such as we are right here, that the obligation of telling the impact story is going to be even more difficult than it was before. And it's especially because of the hard decisions some funders are making, right, in terms of social services versus arts. And I think we can, all of us here are really pretty adept at telling the story about why arts are critical in so many settings. But I think it's going to be the impact story is going to be the biggest challenge for us.
Because of the strain on all the other social service and health networks. Yeah, Leticia.
Well, I think building on that, and it's been out there in the ethos a bit, but this idea that, I mean, you know, we know the arts are essential. We know all of those things. But the reality is the arts intersect with so many different sectors. And that impact story has to go beyond art is good for you because it's beautiful and it's passionate. I mean, and this is sort of the ongoing conversation that our sector constantly has. But I think we're seeing more and more as we think about how some of the federal money is coming down and how some of the shifts in terms of supporting community, investing back into the community, right? Not investing in law enforcement, but investing into the community. The reality is we know that arts and culture organizations, particularly in communities, have been doing that work forever. And this is in many ways that opportunity to ensure that we're part of those conversations. And that's a hard thing to do, I think, often when we talk about, you know, if we're talking about mission and your mission is that I deliver, you know, arts in schools, or I deliver, you know, but the reality is, you know, we are seeing parks and recs, and we're seeing libraries and the restorative justice work and thinking about intervention, all of that. There is a place for the arts in those conversations. And I think this is that moment when we talk about renewal, recovery. That's what the arts are going to, that's how we're going to get there.
So cross-sector work, work embedded within every field. Because if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem, right?
And they're different dollars.
Did you want to add anything, Charmaine? What's life in the future for the arts look like?
Interesting. I was going to take you back, Laura. Even though you're much younger than me, I'm going to take you back to remembering when you get rid of the Arts Endowment in 79, 80. When Ronald
Oh, yeah. I knew. I was there.
Yeah. Well, see, but you were such an infant.
There you go.
Literally, yes. And literally, the arts community had to learn to come in and have conversations with people in ways different than I'm the arts and you just don't understand me. And we learned how to speak differently and engage differently and etc. And I think that not only is the teacher right on board with this issue of cross sector, but it actually happens to be the mantra of my firm. And I think that the reason I know that this works is because for a lot of organizations, they have always been engaged in this manner. It is at the core of the work. So when they say they're an anchor institution in their neighborhood, it isn't because they get the most money. They really are an anchor institution in their neighborhood, and they go to hire the mothers who are on foster care and the kids who can't afford the classes. And you know, I think of places like the Little Washington Dance Theater where they own their own building in a neighborhood that changed after the riots of the 90s, and now may be on its way back, but they always invested in the neighborhood. So I think that kind of one, investment in neighborhood, and two, actually creating community engagement opportunities, as opposed to, I just filled my seats with 2,000 kids from Watts. But I'm not saying that's not good, but I'm saying it's not enough. So if I were to put my crystal ball on, I think greater cross-cultural exchange and and cross-sector engagement as a natural part of whatever mission you have, and less neutrality. I think that all arts organizations, whether they are a Cal Arts that I sit on, or a museum or a dance company or whatever, will look at what is their role in the world in terms of what they're creating. And even if their role is just to create something beautiful, right? There's no other purpose than just to be beautiful. Then they have to convey why that beauty is important and be the best at it that they can be. But really, everybody's got to start to decide that they understand where their thing fit within the world. This can't just be my personal aesthetic interest, which is what the arts in some respects were. And I say the same thing to donors. If donors and funders, particularly foundations and governments, are not going to broaden the aesthetic or the idea of what constitutes art, we're going to be right back here in this same moment. And it'll happen even faster because the phone will happen faster and the video will come faster, and etc. But
so it'll be a new crisis, but the same result. A new
Exactly.
crisis, but the same result. I think you're right. So to just, I agree with everything that you've all said. I think clearly the performing arts is going to have a harder time in general than the visual arts. It's going to be much, much harder to come back. It relies so much on the live audience experience, which no matter what you do can't really be replicated in any other way. And I think we just had Ricardo join us, who is our IT person. Ricardo, if you could turn off your video. So that's one thing. I think the largest, so in line with what Mary Ellen was talking about in terms of this move toward urban, I think there's going to be, frankly, the same consolidation toward the big. Unfortunately, we have spent the past 3 decades in Los Angeles trying to move from a arts ecology where there was a flotilla of really small organizations and a few really big ones at the top. So it was almost like a pillar with a base, to try and build it into a real triangle where you had a robust set of mid-sized organizations representing the diversity of Los Angeles in terms of geography, culture, interests, that had some capacity. And I hate to say this, but I think that the mid-sized or the largest organizations with large endowments will survive one way or another. They have the resources to see it through. I think the smallest organizations, ironically, will survive because they're mostly volunteer driven and people have other jobs anyway. And so they will kind of disappear a little bit and then they will come back. But I think there's going to be tremendous negative impact on the field to the mid-sized sector. And I hate to say it, but I think we might very well be turning back the clock a couple of decades to what the arts, at least in Los Angeles, look like, because we do not have the robust philanthropy to support the organizations of this size now if this goes on too long. So I fear for that. But I do agree that the future positioning and being part of the solution is going to help determine who lives and who doesn't. So we have a related question from Felicia as we're kind of sliding now into our last 10 minutes, which is what do we say to young people now about a career in the arts?
So can I go first?
Yes, please.
You know what? So people can look at my bio and see that I started off as a dancer and then I went into arts administration. And when I was sure I wasn't going to go back to dancing, I went to law school at nighttime, and then when I wasn't doing that, I practiced law, but not because I thought I was going to stay in it. It was going to be transactional, and then lo and behold, the phone rings, and it's Arthur Mitchell, and he says, "Come run Dance to the Park." And I think, how often is the world going to do this? In my case, I said that on purpose. In my case, the only thing I ever wanted to do was dance. And my mother had her own legal secretarial service, so I knew how to type and do all of that stuff on the side. And I worked temp jobs in between gigs, and I worked professionally as a dancer for 9 years until the day I was on stage and realized I was thinking about something else, and that maybe I was ready to explore some other things. Sort of like when Letitia says, "Oh my God, I didn't mean to stop dancing. I just didn't know how to do it halfway." And I'm saying that because it depends on how you come at the world. Had I come at the world with, how can I have a job and I'm going to make as much money, and I one day want to be the head of the Met Museum and blah, 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 I would have approached the world very differently. I approached it from the point of view of art is my live and die on. If I had approached it the other way, I'd probably be a little better off right this moment. But the real issue is, it came from my passion about what I wanted to do, how I thought I could give back to the world. And the one thing I encourage anybody is that even if you find yourself in the job that you don't like, if you look up and feel that it is giving you something back, that if you believe, let me rephrase this, if you believe that whatever you learn, you can take along with you to the next job and the next job and the next job, then you actually have built something that creates the opportunity for you to be lots of things. There's not one skill in nonprofit arts management that you can't take into a Fortune 500 company. And I can tell you, I can prove it. Not one. And I even sat on the board of a NASDAQ company, and they pay money, in case anybody wants one. But
that's because we're so good at process.
And that's just it. If you learn, I was a locker room attendant when I was in high school. I've been working since I was 16. What I learned from that job went into every job I had thereafter. So if you, no matter how, be the best street sweeper, then when you become the head of facilities and street sweeping, you know what this is supposed to look like. Yeah. If you put it down, you don't come away with what you can get out of that job. So yeah, go into arts management if you want to. Make a side to make sure you understand how to read budgets and all the other stuff. Keep your passion so you have one, but get the other stuff going in there with you.
Mary Ellen, you're nodding.
I'm nodding, and I'm also thinking that one of the most important aspects of being an arts manager is about being a steward. And that if you come to it with your own personal validation about, for me, it's about being a part of great music, great classical music. And so the going to the concert, and I would hope that young career people would take that joy from that, and then understand that really being a successful arts administrator is being this steward, right? So that often you put the art ahead of yourself. And if you have that ability to time shift, then I think you can do it. But that's an important thing to be equipped with.
Leticia?
I was a poli-sci major in college. So, you know, and I sort of not fell into it, but my career was very much in for-profit entertainment companies. But the bottom line is, I think it goes back to this idea of the arts in terms of cross-sector. It doesn't all have to be, I work for an arts organization. It could be that I work for a social service organization that understands the need to incorporate and integrate arts into that work. So I think what has happened, at least for me as I was sort of coming up, was this idea that you're going into the arts and you either have to be a performer or you're going to work backstage or you're going to, but the reality is, at least now, and I've seen this over the course of my time, the last 10 years really involved with the county, a lot of that work is no longer just at arts organizations. It's not just as a teaching artist. It goes beyond that. And I mean, you know, for any of artists out there right now, Parks and Recreation, LA County Parks is looking for artists to hire to provide classes to young people who are not going into school. So I think it's important that we expand our idea of what it means to go into the arts beyond I work at a cultural institution or I work at an art museum or a performing arts venue.
Yeah.
I'm really excited by what the next generation is going to bring to the field. We've never been in need of more reimagining and innovation and reinventing. And the fact that things aren't going to look like they were is fine. They shouldn't stay frozen in time. They need to change and evolve. And so I think there are, you know how contracts these days include rights for media not yet invented? I think that there are going to be roles for the arts and for people who want to work in the arts and arts managers that have not yet been invented, but they will have the joy of inventing them. So we're going to close with just one last thing that will be just either a word or a sentence. Rebecca asked a great question about the core message that you often reflect on that you received from a mentor during your career. That is a touchstone for you. That's something that you reflect back on that has informed how you meet huge challenges and crises when you're faced with them. Who would like? Yes, Leticia.
And it solidified as my time at the Arts Commission, and I didn't have a way to articulate it until then, but I experienced it across the board. It doesn't matter to you who gets the credit. Then you get the job done. And I go back to that. I use that to center myself all of the time. It's not about me, and it's not about getting the credit. It's about moving the work forward.
Great.
Thank you, Elsie.
Mary Ellen.
I think it's about never giving up and being persistent, because I think that's a skill we all have here, right? Is that once we know what's the best for the organization and the community, we don't give up.
Charmaine?
I would say in nonprofit, it's being devoted to the vision. There's no point in being a nonprofit taking a job because it's a job. Really deciding that you're devoted to what the vision is and how can you serve it. If you are comfortable with being in service to a nonprofit or to an art form or to an artist, you'll have great satisfaction out of that. If you're trying to figure out how you can have it raise you to the top, you may not be satisfied and it may not last that long.
And my great mentor when I was starting out told me, and you referred to this before, Leticia, which is why I always pass it on, that basically our job in life is to remove obstacles for others and to create a pathway for them to soar. And I find that really concentrating on that always brings a whole group around me to move things forward. And I like safety in numbers. So we are just about out of time. I want to thank you all so much for this wonderful, wonderful, wonderful conversation, and for everybody who joined us. Someone asked, and I know that CGU is recording this. I don't know what their plans are for making it available, but I want to toss it back to Teresa if you want to come back on screen.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Laura. I'm really moved. I was actually just a little distracted because I was scribbling down your quote about your job in life being to remove obstacles for others. I've also written down a ton of quotes, especially from you, Charmaine. Thank you so much. And thank you to each and every one of our panelists I appreciate not only your candor, but also you're willing to be vulnerable. Personally, for me, a panel talk is a little boring if we don't actually get some real talk. And I really think this was an incredibly engaging conversation. So I thank all of you. Also behind the scenes too, I would like to thank our CGU IT department, our Ricardo and Sunny. We of course have Margot and Avita helping me out. And then our director, Jonathan, and our program administrator, Jody, without whom we definitely couldn't do probably any of this. So yes, and to answer the question, we will be, we have recorded all of this, and I will be sending out the link to anyone who registered through Eventbrite, and of course our panelists as well. So a big thanks to all of you. I'm going to steal our director, Jonathan's end quote and say, more to come. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Signing
Thank you.
off. Thank
Thank
you
you
so
all.
much.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Yes, yes, you're all wonderful.
Teresa, this is Ricardo. Go ahead and press stop on the recording first.